Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, increased harassment, abuse and violence. Hostility towards journalists is on the rise as the world marks this year's World Press Freedom Day. According to many organizations and unions that represent media workers, assaults and attacks on journalists have increased globally, and there's been a marked decline in press freedom. Political polarization caused by the pandemic has been behind much of the rising animosity towards journalists, particularly through social media. There are also warnings that law enforcement agencies have become more heavy-handed in their treatment of media workers. As the world marks the 30th anniversary of the UNESCO Declaration for the Development of a Free, Independent and Pluralistic Press, we'll assess the state of press freedom around the world in general and Nigeria and Africa in particular. Coming up. Now, according to a whole slew of press freedom surveys, journalists around the world in general and across Africa in particular are fearful of an increasingly hostile working environment. Physical assaults, online abuse and harassment by law enforcement agencies are becoming common. A quarter of all journalists surveyed in the last 2 years said they had been assaulted at least once, and 1 in 5 said they'd been harassed by police whilst reporting. And a larger number said they had been subjected to threats to their safety online. Those journalists who have not been physically attacked or harassed themselves say they are fearful that threats and intimidation are on the rise, and that is taking an emotional toll on them. The UN has described such reports as unsettling, especially as journalists are being exposed to a much more than acceptable critique of their work, often with the encouragement of politicians. We'll talk about all that in a moment, but first, here's the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres delivering his message on World Press Freedom Day 2021.
In pandemic underlined the critical role of reliable, verified and universally accessible information in saving lives and building strong, resilient societies. During the pandemic and in other crises, including the climate emergency, journalists and media workers help us navigate a fast-changing and often overwhelming landscape of information, while addressing dangerous inaccuracies and falsehoods. In too many countries, they run great personal risk, including new restrictions, censorship, abuse, harassment, detention, and even death, simply for doing their jobs. And the situation continues to worsen. The economic impact of the pandemic has hit many media outlets hard, threatening their very survival. As budget tightens, so too does access to reliable information. Rumors, falsehoods, and extreme or divisive opinions surge in to fill the gap. I urge all governments to do everything in their power to support a free, independent and diverse media.
And that's the UN Secretary General there, Antonio Guterres, delivering his message on World Press Freedom Day. Well, for more about the day and the state of press freedom in Nigeria, Africa and around the world, I'm joined now in the studio by Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, Senior Fellow at the respected think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development, by Christopher Isiguzo, National President of the Nigerian Union of Journalists, and via webex from Paris, France, by Arnaud who's a journalist and head of the Africa desk at Reporters Without Borders. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for joining us. Let's go first to you, Arnaud Froger. Okay, I'm told Right, okay, I'm told that he's dropped out, so they're trying to get him back on. But with me here, of course, Professor Ibrahim and Christopher Isiguzo. Thank you very much indeed to both of you for coming in. What do you make of the state of the press, Professor, in this particular year, against the backdrop of the things that have happened in Nigeria and across the world with the pandemic and all the rest of it?
I think it's been a very difficult 1 year for the media in general. The pandemic impacted negatively on the ability to move and to do things. The pandemic was also accompanied by conspiracy theories, rumors, falsehood. So the work of the ordinary journalist became much more difficult because there are all these narratives to counter, and the ability to go out, research, and find out what's happening reduced. But in terms of the question of media freedom, I think part of the problem is that certain regimes have always seen the media as threats to whatever they're doing, and have therefore tried to either muzzle them or do whatever they can to make them shut up. There's a sense in which we've had that in Nigeria over the past year. But I want to make the general point that the Nigerian media has one definition that's irrepressible. When you go back to 1859, when the first newspaper was launched in this country, are talking of a long history. And throughout that history, the whole of our nationalism, the attacks on the British imperialism are all led by the media. Throughout military rule,
Absolutely.
the media stood its ground and attacked military rule as a system. So I think on World Press Freedom Day, we should also salute the Nigerian media for its boldness, its lack of fear, its capacity to persevere in difficult circumstances. We should therefore salute them today.
Well, thank you for setting that out. And Christopher Isiguzo, National President of the Nigerian Union of Journalists, I expect that's a sentiment you can identify with. But specifically, because obviously you're in the field, along with overseeing or at least trying to give some form of protection to a lot of the journalists who do that sort of work, what are the barriers that journalists still face in a country like Nigeria?
Thank you. Well, I want to first join the professor in also saluting the Nigerian media for being courageous, being irrepressible in the face of daunting challenges, myriads of issues threatening its very existence. We operate in a very peculiar environment. Reporters Without Borders described our situation as we are operating in a very dangerous climate, and that speaks volume. We have the issue of economic challenge. You recall at the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic last year, of course, it got to Nigeria in February. It took off as a public health challenge. Along the line, it also attacked our economy. The entire system was literally shut down, and the media was worst hit, because we basically rely on patronage, advertisements from organizations, corporate bodies, individuals, governments. And when our economy was attacked, it wasn't a small thing, because the implication was that with our economic independence, so to speak, attacked, it was also going to attack our editorial independence, because the implication was that we are not going to go cap in hands, seeking for people to assist us. I recall at a point we even had to appeal to government that the media was going down. You need to come and help us.
Because there's a price to pay when that sort of thing happens.
I recall in one of our meetings with the NPAN, Newspaper Proprietors Association of Nigeria, the Guild of Editors, the leadership of the NUJ was there, and of course the Minister of Information, who were appealing that as it is done in other climes, you need to come and assist the media, because if this situation culminates in the eventual collapse of the media, the implication is that the entire system, the country in itself, is gone. Democracy takes flight. And the implication of that, assuming they come to your rescue. It simply means they will also bring something to the table.
Right.
And you're not going to ignore it. So that in itself became a major challenge that was brought to us, courtesy the pandemic.
So that was an additional challenge.
Of course.
In addition to the
Of
thing
course.
that Professor was talking
Of
about,
course.
the harassment and all the rest of it.
Beyond other challenges that
Right.
we've had over time.
Right, okay. Well, we've got about a minute and a half before we have to take a break. I'm told that Arnaud Froger is back with us. Arnaud, presumably you can hear me now. This, of course, an opportunity to celebrate the core principles of a free press, remind governments of the need to respect that freedom and pay tribute, as the two guests here were saying, to the journalists who carry out the work. What would you say very briefly, and if I have to interrupt you, I will, but we'll come back and continue with you. What would you say is the state of press freedom around the world in general, and Africa in particular today, as we mark World Press Freedom Day?
Well, as the UN Secretary General said prior to this show, the situation continues to worsen, unfortunately, and the case of Nigeria is very indicative of what is happening actually worldwide. We are witnessing more and more journalists getting assaulted, getting arrested by the judicial system, getting arrested sometimes online as well, getting arrested on the continent. I just heard that a journalist in Congo today was sentenced to a 6-year prison term, despite the fact that it's forbidden by the law and by international standards to imprison a journalist for press offenses. So the situation continues to worsen, and in Africa, if I might add, the situation is very dark and gloomy. If you look at the map published by Reporters Without Borders, you can witness that and see that there are 23 countries out of 48 in sub-Saharan Africa, so nearly half the continent colored in red or in black, which means that the press freedom situation in these countries is bad or very bad.
Arnaud, I'm going to ask you to stay with us. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we have to take a break, but we'll come straight back to you. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the state of press freedom around the globe as the world marks World Press Freedom Day. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Each year, the Paris-based Reporters Without Borders, or RSF, publishes the World Press Freedom Index, which ranks 180 countries according to their media independence, transparency, acts of violence against journalists, and several other criteria. According to the latest survey published in April 2021, ahead of World Press Freedom Day on May the 3rd, today, journalism is under serious threat in almost 3/4 of all countries. The report describes the situation in those places as problematic, bad, or very bad. Only 12 countries have respectable press freedom environments, the lowest number since 2013, when the current evaluation methodology was adopted.
It is World Press Freedom Day, a day to honor the vital role that journalists play in fostering vibrant and secure democracies where the free exchange of ideas help communities flourish. Independent journalists provide the public with accurate information, promote accountability, and draw attention to human rights abuses and corruption. We have unfortunately seen increased targeting of journalists all around the world. They must be able to do their jobs without fear of violence, threats, or unjust detention. In our increasingly digital world, press freedom and the free flow of information requires internet freedom. The United States condemns the use of government-imposed internet restrictions and shutdowns that often occur during elections or times of conflict to silence journalists and prevent access to information. Freedom of expression must be protected both online and offline. Thank you to journalists and media workers everywhere for promoting accountability, transparency, and more informed societies.
And that's a spokesperson from the US State Department there, delivering a message on World Press Freedom Day. And with me in the studio, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, Senior Fellow at the think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development, Christopher Isiguzo, National President of the Nigerian Union of Journalists, and via webex from Paris, France, Arnaud, journalist and head of the Africa desk at Reporters Without Borders. And of course, Reporters Without Borders, they produce the index of press freedom around the world, and that's what we were talking about previously. And let me come back to you, Arnaud. Apologies for interrupting you. We had to take a break. You were giving us an outline of how press freedom is under threat for journalists around the world on a daily basis.
Yes, what we can say is that there is still a huge hostility against journalism, and Africa is no exception, with at least 33 journalists who got killed over the last 5 years on the continent. There is still a lot of distrust and mistrust, even among the authorities and the general public regarding journalists. There is also a very worrying tendency, a dynamic to make journalists more irrelevant or more invisible in this information chaos of ours in the world today. And there is also what we fear, a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability, not only from the authorities, but also from the social platforms who are actually doing a pretty bad job in terms of regulating information and disinformation online, with absolutely no transparency and no accountability so far, despite the fact that they are very shaping or even reshaping the public debate in our democracies, which is of course a tremendous role for private companies to have.
That's absolutely right, and we'll come back to you in a moment. Let me come to you, Professor Ibrahim, because we were talking before Arnaud came in about you talked about how journalists are operating at a time of COVID-19 and all the issues that go with it. I mean, you'd think that during the pandemic and in times of crisis when information can be a matter of life or death, I mean, there'd be gestures of appreciation towards journalists, but the contrary appears to be the case. I mean, to some extent.
Well, that's the situation for obvious reasons. A lot of our governments in Africa prepared very poorly for the pandemic. They were behind the curve at each point in time. They needed to cover up their tracks because their tracks was producing death and suffering in community. And therefore, it became a moment where they felt really threatened by objective journalism that was showcasing their failures to the community, to the nation, and to the world at large. And that was why they tended to be even more heavy-handed than they had been previously. The fact of the matter is that whenever there's crisis in society of whatever nature, it brings out poor governance very clearly, and people are able to know who to hold responsible for the difficult situations they find themselves in. And therefore, it's an important moment for the media to come out, intervene, and produce narratives of truth to the people. But these narratives of truth are daggers in the hearts of people who are malgoverning their society. And that's why it creates a context in which you have dramatic effort by government to cover up, and the media tries, within the difficulties it finds itself, to expose the reality of what's going on to the people.
That's a very, very interesting point, because of course, and part of what happens, Mr. Isiguzo, is that they then group all journalism together, including some of the errant things you find on social media. There's no separation, and that gives them the criteria to go ahead and leap down from a great height on the people who are actually doing proper journalism. But given the restrictions that journalists are confronted with, for instance, in Nigeria, how do they operate?
Well, the way we operate here is akin to making water from stone, not just stone, white stone. Is pretty difficult.
If not impossible.
If not impossible. We operate in a very unfriendly environment. Very unfriendly environment. Beyond the challenges that we face daily, you also have government incessant interference. Today the broadcast media, they are practically operating on their toes. Because you don't even know what you're going to say. The guest you're going to bring, what he will say, that is going to enrage the regulators. Every other day you wake up, you hear of fines, clamp down, we're going to shut down, we're going to do this. There is that psychological attack on the media. That in itself is a major issue. And we keep calling on government to, why you have stakeholders is, when you have such issues, you bring them together. How do we make things right? For instance, in the Broadcasting Organization of Nigeria, you just wake up and you cite one section of the Broadcasting Code, and you begin to act on it. You don't want to know the dynamics, the realities, what presently obtains in the field. You begin to act. That in itself is not a good one. It's an aberration. When you have issues, you think, like now we have peculiar security challenges. It becomes very necessary that our thinking government, our thinking regulator should bring stakeholders. How do we resolve this challenge?
Right. Okay, let me ask you to hold your thoughts. We'll come back to you so you can complete them. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the state of press freedom around the globe as the world marks World Press Freedom Day. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolu. They are threatened and sometimes assaulted at public events, while social media has now evolved into a vehicle for abuse, harassment and threats against journalists. Sometimes these attacks are one-offs, but increasingly they are part of a torrent of abuse. This year's World Press Freedom Day marks the 30th anniversary of the UNESCO Windhoek Declaration for the Development of a Free, Independent and Pluralistic Press. That declaration led to the recognition by the UN of a special day for press freedom to be celebrated every 3rd of May. The importance of freely accessing reliable information, particularly through journalism, has been demonstrated by the COVID-19 pandemic. In times of crisis such as this, information can be a matter of life or death, but the COVID-19 crisis has also placed journalists around the world at the center of threats, forcing the closure of media houses, with reporters harassed and attacked for their reporting, and the public struggling to discern verified information from the falsehoods that have flooded the internet.
Free and independent journalism is our greatest ally in combating misinformation and disinformation. The United Nations Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists aims to create a safe environment for media workers across the globe because information is a public good. Today, we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Windhoek Declaration for the Development of a Free, Independent and Pluralistic African Press. Despite dramatic changes in the media over the past 3 decades, the Declaration's urgent call for press freedom and free access to information is as relevant as ever. Let's reflect on its message and renew our efforts to protect media freedom so that information remains a life-saving public good for all.
And that's the UN Secretary General there, Antonio Guterres, giving the second part of his message on World Press Freedom Day. And with me in the studio, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, Senior Fellow at the think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development, Christopher Isiguzo, National President of the Nigerian Union of Journalists, and via webex from Paris, France, Arnaud, journalist and head of the Africa desk at Reporters Without Borders. Thank you for staying with us. And let me come back to you, Mr. Isiguzo, because you were completing a thought before we went on break.
Yes, so talking about the incessant interference from the regulators, you know, and I was stressing the need for them to constantly engage the stakeholders, you know, because they are the ones in the field. They understand the intricacies, the dynamics, and the realities and all that, you know, and they needed to engage them and not to constantly make reference to their rule books, you know. It's very, very important that we do that. And beyond that, the issue of regulators' interference, we also see this constant harassment. Of course, you've talked about it, you know, intimidations of journalists. You know, I'm going to make a reference to a few issues. Very briefly, I'll say. In October 2020, Onifade Belumi, I hope I got that, a 20-year-old intern who was detailed by his media organization to cover the alleged invasion of a warehouse that was stocked with COVID-19 palliatives. At a point, he was arrested by the police. Nobody heard anything about him, and at a point, he was now found in a mortuary.
Yes, I saw that.
Good, you are aware of that.
Horrible
Good.
Story.
You remember the story of Precious Owolabi, who of course was a stray bullet hit him while in the line of duty. Today, who has been arrested? Of course, nothing like that happened. Remember Lex Obu? The same thing happened, and nothing happened about that today. We have Ebanga Isine.
Yes, I read about that.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
And what have we heard about that? Several journalists, some journalists, Lawal Abdullahi Izala, Baba Jaje, Abu Hamza, arrested by the Katsina State Police Command. What have we heard about that? So when you hear about these stories, unresolved issues, then it puts fear in the journalists out there.
Absolutely.
If this could happen, that means it could have been me. It could have been somebody else.
Absolutely. And let me bring Professor Ibrahim in, because the points, and I'm very glad you made these points, because that puts a human face and a name to these broad generalizations of what journalists go through. They're real people who are going through these things. And Professor, I wonder if the threat of intimidation and violence would make it more difficult, if not impossible, for Nigerian journalists to do any sort of investigative journalism in this country. Because that is seen a guy you were talking about. He's investigating killings in the north, and he can't do anything because they've completely, surrounded him. These military massacres, as we're talking about, for example, this would make it impossible for people. There's a lot of criticism that Nigerian journalists don't do investigative journalism, but you do so at your own peril, don't you?
Yes, that's the fact of the matter. Investigative journalism is extremely difficult because those in power who feel they suffer when the reality of what they are doing gets known to the public are able to take measures to deal with journalists who are doing that. State governors in particular have been very notorious for organizing with the police to pick up and illegally detain journalists that are revealing things about them. Just today we had reports that Jafar, who came out with a video on Governor Ganduje in Kano over the dollar issue has had to flee to the United Kingdom because he felt there was a real threat to his life. I feel, therefore, it's extremely difficult situation, but we do have a number of media organs who are still able to engage in investigative journalism in spite of the objective difficulties as well as the risks they encounter in doing their work.
Well, let me bring you in Arnaud Froger, head of the Africa desk at Reporters Without Borders. Thank you for staying with us. Just give us a sense from your index of where the key trouble spots for journalists right now are in Africa. Obviously, we've been spending a lot of time talking about Nigeria, but there are a number of other places, aren't there?
Yes, of course. There are simply countries in which there is no journalism or no independent journalism anymore. If you look at the very bottom of the index, you can see that in countries like Djibouti or Eritrea, journalists are either in prison, either in exile, or they just quitted their job and they're doing something else, because you have no independent journalism in these countries anymore. There are also countries in which journalism is an activity that is done in a very, very hostile environment. In Somalia, for example, half of the African journalists who got killed over the last decade were Somali journalists. There are countries like in Burundi or in Zimbabwe or in Uganda. We've seen that over the recent elections where journalists are constantly harassed, intimidated, or arrested. But Nigeria is getting very close to this bunch of countries now, and what your guest said, either the president or the professor, is very indicative of the hostility that journalists are facing. People who are doing investigative journalism in Nigeria now have to flee their own country because of their reporting. So the situation in Nigeria is very serious, and I would say that in Western Africa, it's now the most dangerous country for journalists, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a very worrying revelation. But just briefly, so that we're very clear on this for people who may not know, what are the criteria that Reporters Without Borders uses to rank countries on that World Press Freedom Index?
Okay, to narrow it down very briefly, there are 7 indicators. I will not name them all, but there is pluralism, of course, the level of independency by the media, the environment, the level of self-censorship, the legal framework, as well, and of course, the level of exactions that are committed against media practitioners in the country. We do not the index on our own. In each country, we send questionnaires with about 100 questions to experts so that we get data from the ground and from local sources, mostly journalists, and we confront that, we compare that to the own data we have gathered over the year, and then it gives us a score, and that allows us to rank the countries from 1 to 180.
Okay, Arnaud, thanks very much indeed. Stay with us. Let me come to you, Professor Ibrahim, because there are some people, although I don't subscribe to their arguments, but in the interest of balance, we have to put that forward. There are people who say that to some extent, this comes with the territory, that if you're a policeman or a policewoman, you expect to confront criminals and some hostility from the public when you're, trying to break up protests, etc. If you're a soldier, you expect to be targeted by fighters on the other side. So if you're a reporter and a journalist, you expect to rub people, and particularly the authorities, up the wrong way.
Yes, in a sense, that's true, and that's why there's always been consequences. But the issue really is, what type of consequences are we talking about? If the consequence is to shut up the journalist, then that becomes negative and unacceptable. If the consequence is to disregard your laws and maltreat, beat up, sometimes even kill a journalist because you don't like the work they are doing, then you are actually violating your own laws, and that obviously is totally unacceptable. So it does come with the territory. Information has always been a very delicate issue. Governments in democracies, for example, depend on public opinion to guarantee their re-election, and therefore negative public opinion is formed when people learn of things that had happened that were not correct. And that's why they become extremely sensitive. I'm talking of in democratic countries. In autocratic or authoritarian countries, it's even more problematic because these governments have brazen disregard for the rights of citizens and therefore would want to punish any person that tries to expose the ways in which they engage in violation of the rights of their own citizens. Right. What we are saying, therefore, is that journalism has always been a very difficult profession, one that's always carried risks. And this is around the world. It's not just a Nigerian or African problem. Absolutely. It is a difficult job.
We've got about 40 seconds, so don't take it personally if I have to interrupt you again, Isiguzo. But I mean, we've got to take a break, but we'll come straight back to you. And these attacks, are they overt on journalists in Nigeria, for example? Or are they often a way of making the work of the journalists more difficult, you know, a kind of intimidation?
Naturally, when you attack people, you know, you instill fear in them. There is that psychological burden, you know, when you attack them, you know, and especially when those issues remain unresolved. You know, oftentimes we have taken up some of these issues. The other day, some 3 days ago or 4, a journalist was whisked from Abuja all the way to Benue State.
You must hear some pretty horror stories in your job.
Every day.
But let me ask you to stay with us because we'll come back and finish that thought. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the state of press freedom around the globe as the world marks World Press Freedom Day. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniekolo. The 2021 World Press Freedom Index, compiled by Reporters Without Borders, shows that journalism is completely or partly blocked in 73% of the 180 countries ranked by the organization. Although there was less deterioration in Africa's abuses score, it continues to be the most violent continent for journalists, and the COVID-19 pandemic fueled the use of force to prevent journalists from working in places like Tanzania, for example. President John Magufuli called the virus a Western conspiracy, suggesting that Tanzania had kept it at bay by force of prayer. He imposed an information blackout on the pandemic before his death in March 2021. According to the index, Nigeria is one of West Africa's most dangerous and difficult countries for journalists. They are often spied on, attacked, arbitrarily arrested, or even killed. The index says that the all-powerful regional governors are often the media's most determined persecutors and tend to act with complete impunity. And with me in the studio, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, Senior Fellow at the think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development, Christopher Isiguzo, National President of the Nigerian Union of Journalists, and via webex from Paris, France, Arnaud, journalist and head of the Africa desk at Reporters Without Borders. And let's come to you, back to you, Mr. Isiguzo, so you can complete your thought briefly.
Yeah, like I was saying, a journalist was taken from here because there was a report credited to him where he was actually asking a governor to do his job. You know, like Prof said, these people they know that you are supposed to hold them to account, and nobody likes that. You know, the Constitution has given us that responsibility, you know, to hold people to account. And they know that in this part of the world, leaders don't like being held to account.
Absolutely.
That's the truth. They don't like it. They just want to operate on their own. And that's the problem. So that's why you have these attacks, intimidation. Of course, the essence of the attack is to intimidate you so that you don't do the right thing. Like you observed earlier, the issue of investigative journalism is now taking the back seat. That is it, because a whole lot is involved.
Absolutely.
A banger is seen. Of course, he can't tell us all he's seen.
He was investigating massacres in northern Nigeria.
Of course.
Yeah.
We have so many issues that journalists should be out there investigating.
Absolutely.
But the environment is not conducive enough for you to do it.
Yes. Now let me bring you in, Arnaud Frogere. Thank you for your patience. Nigeria, according to your index, is now ranked 115 out of 180 countries. It fell 5 places from last year on the index. So that means that things are clearly getting worse then.
Yes, of course, and I think your guests here have portrayed a very dark picture of the situation of press freedom in their own country. The case of Ibanga in Sine is very indicative of the state of straits that a journalist, an investigative journalist, can face while reporting. There are cases now of, as I said earlier, journalists that are constrained to flee their country because of their reporting. They also mentioned cases of journalists who got killed. Nothing has been done. No serious investigation has been carried out to bring the perpetrators to justice. We have also this case of this young website, the People's Gazette, that has been censored by the authorities because of its investigative reporting. So the situation is very, very serious, I'm afraid, in Nigeria. And the country is going down in the index for several years now, and no one knows where it's going to stop, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a very disturbing revelation indeed. And Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, is there also judicial harassment where journalists are charged with spreading false news or inciting the public, etc.? I mean, is that part of it as well?
Definitely, that's part of it. The judiciary for every society often sees itself as part of the power structure and tends to have the same type of visceral reaction that people who occupy executive offices have. The point must, however, be made that we live in a difficult world where there's a lot of fake news, where there's a lot of provocation, including in the media, and there is sometimes the need to make sure that you address such problems. The president raised the issue of broadcasting in Nigeria, but the fact of the matter is we've also had some broadcast media that have engaged in irresponsible journalism. And when that happens, any authority that has power over that must be able to respond. The line is, however, drawn. Whether you do that to protect political authority or you do that because you are concerned that conflict and violence might be provoked in society because of your reportage. And often it's difficult to make the distinction between those two. And that's why we must always be watchful, interrogate and question each time there is an attempt to gag the media. The principle of freedom of expression is extremely important in any democracy, and we must always ensure that that freedom takes priority over other considerations.
Very good points there, and the particularly interesting, Christopher Isiguzo, that he mentioned is the fact that journalism isn't always above board, is it? I mean, there are also people who plant malicious things and actually pay newspapers and things to write things about some other person, and then you find that the person is having to deny a claim that doesn't in fact exist in real life. So that's also an issue. Obviously, that's not going to overshadow the bigger question. But I understand that in addition to violence, the Nigerian government has limited access to the presidency, for example, to a handful of media outlets that are nearly all controlled by or supportive of the government. I mean, is that a clear example of attempts to limit the media's ability to operate freely and properly?
Well, I think the issue that we're discussing today has to do with press freedom. To what extent are we free? And I'm glad that our colleague from Reporters Without Borders has been able to capture it properly, that this has now become about one of the most dangerous places to apply this
you mean Nigeria?
trade. Yes.
Yeah.
When Prof was talking about the issue of the judiciary and all that, you know, earlier on I made mention of certain laws that we have, and some of these regulators, and of course the judicial system, tries to take advantage of these laws. I recall the Cybercrime Act of 2015. We are not talking about it, but I must tell you that so many journalists have been prosecuted as a result of that act. Now I'm going to read a particular section 24 of the Act penalizes cyber stalking or messages that are false for the purpose of causing annoyance, inconvenience, danger, obstruction,
annoyance,
insult, injury, criminal intimidation, enmity, hatred, ill will, or needless anxiety to another. Then who is the person that will interpret this, your message, to mean causing annoyance?
Absolutely.
The judiciary is going to take is a liberty to interpret that, right? And so many journalists have been detained, prosecuted as a result of this act.
Right, okay. I'm going to have to say that on that rather sad note, we have come to the end of the discussion, but this is something that will continue to crop up for some time to come. Christopher Isiguzo, National President of the Nigerian Union of Journalists, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, Senior Fellow at the think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development, and via webex from Paris, France, Arnaud, journalist and head of the Africa desk at Reporters Without Borders. Thank you very much indeed to all three of you. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and France. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.